Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. And today we're going to talk about Star Trek, one of my very favorite things to talk about. This is the source book about the Delta Quadrant. We've looked at all three other quadrants already, and they all have their use. Delta Quadrant, as awesome as it is not as immediately useful as the other three. Which is not to say that you shouldn't get it, because I definitely think you should, even if only for the Borg stuff. But it has a bunch of other things as well to recommend it. The trick is figuring out how to use all of it. So anyway, let's dig in and take a look. Now, the Delta Quadrant is, as you can see from the picture, and I'm sure you already know, that is the part of space that Star Trek Voyager takes place in. You can see kind of a map of the galaxy behind me, back here, and so the galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, is split into four quadrants, and Earth is kind of, as you can see, right above my head here, right on the line between Alpha and Beta, and so they use Alpha and Beta a lot because it's very easy to get into them. The Klingons and the Romulans are right there in the Beta Quadrant. Cardassia, Bajor, right there in the Alpha Quadrant. And then, over here, bing, that's where the Bajoran wormhole lets out into the Gamma Quadrant. And of course, Deep Space Nine talks all about that. And that's where the Dominion is, and all kinds of other things. Now, what you can see behind me right here, and kind of behind the book cover, is there's this entire, this beep right here is where Voyager got transported at the beginning of the series, and then they had to spend their entire thing returning back to Earth, and it was going to take 77 years, and spoiler warning, they managed to get back a little earlier. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the Delta Quadrant is very, very far away. The Borg were able to make the trip using kind of transwarp conduit technology. And there are various other shenanigans that various people are able to go through in order to make that journey. Q could do it, the Traveler could do it, the Caretakers could do it, blah, 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 blah. So anyway, let's let's dig into this and have a look at it. So, what the book starts with is, now, all of the Star Trek Adventures books, the Quadrant books in particular, are structured as if you were reading a briefing from Starfleet or from the Federation that talks about the different areas. And so, for the most part, when you're talking about like the Gamma Quadrant, they get very into the Dominion and the Dominion War because that is their primary interaction with Gamma. With Alpha and Beta, they have, for hundreds of years, they've been exploring both of those quadrants, and so it's a very wide-angle view. And then the Gamma Quadrant, because of the Dominion War, gets a little more focus. Delta Quadrant gets even more focused than that because everything that is presented in here is introduced to you in terms of how Voyager interacted with it. But one of the things that I like is that each of these regions kind of ends with thoughts like, Voyager did this. If we ever go back, maybe we'll want to do this instead. Or maybe we'll follow up on the good progress that they already made. Or maybe we'll need to try a completely different tactic because we saw how badly they screwed it up. Like, there's a lot of different variety in here. Anyway, they kind of start tracking, and it's in alphabetical order rather than in order of the journey for the most part. And so it's not, they found this, and then they found this, and then they found this. But a lot of the major regions of space get neat little descriptions in here. And so, for example, the first one that they encountered was the Kazon. And the Kazon we got to know the Kazon pretty well because they were in Kazon space for a couple of seasons before they finally were able to move on to other things. And so there's a lot of talk about the Kazon and how this can work and blah, blah, blah. And it just keeps going on. And I like all of this information a lot. It talks about species 8472, and we get a lot of description of them. Anyway, it's all great. Good stuff. And if you are a fan of Voyager, as I am, this is really fun to read through as well, because you're like, oh yeah, I remember those guys. And it gives good ideas of how to tell stories about these people. Okay? The Vidians were one of my very favorite little thingies. They didn't come up often in Voyager, but I liked them a lot. So then we get descriptions of different kinds of weird space stuff. Voyager was always the anomaly show where weird science would happen all the time. Janeway herself was a scientist, and so there was a lot of weird science on the fringes of space. Now, these are the worlds of the Delta Quadrant. We were talking before about the kind of major governments and species. Now we're into the worlds. And it talks about some of the different major planets and what they're like and all of this stuff. And then we get to the Borg. And honestly, I suspect that for the vast majority of game groups, probably 90% or more, the Borg is going to be what you'll use out of this book. And because this is something that can be used anywhere. They traveled to the Beta Quadrant, and they attacked Earth directly multiple times. And so it's very easy to run into them. It's very easy to find ways to bring them into the story. And because they were such a huge part of the Delta Quadrant and of Voyager, they get a ton of coverage in this book. So pages and pages and pages. What is it like to be a Borg? How do the Borg function? What do different other people know about the Borg? Just description after description, and it's long and it's all very useful, very great stuff. Different types of Borg drones, types of Borg ships, all of this other stuff. I really love this chapter about Borg locations because it talks not just about who they are as a species or as a group, but where do they live. So we get some stuff about space, we get to talk about terrestrial worlds and different kinds of worlds. And, what about when they live in Earth-like worlds? What about when they live in gaseous worlds? What about when they live in what's called demon worlds, which are worlds that are completely unlivable, unsurvivable for humans and most humanoid species? The Borg don't have that restriction, and so they can live in a lot of really terrible places that would kill anybody else. And we get a lot of these great descriptions, not just of what they're like in terms of flavor, but little crunchy rules you can add on and ideas of how to, do this. Like, you can't read through this section about Borg locations and not think, oh, I really want someone to find a Borg society and have to go, into this Borg planet where they're doing manufacturing or whatever, and then they have to all these environmental hazards. Like, it's really cool, exciting stuff that's going to give you lots of ideas. It even talks about the Unicomplex, which is kind of the big space array of stuff where the Borg were building, this big spaceborne civilization. So, anyway, great stuff. Hooray for the Borg. And we'll come back to the Borg later because there's more of them. But first, let's talk about species of the Delta Quadrant. Now, this is tricky because how are you going to use these? And there are absolutely options. You could go the Neelix option or the Kess option, right? Where your ship shows up in the Delta Quadrant full of Starfleet officers, but then it takes on 1, 2, 3 extra travelers that it finds. It's like, you're local, help us find our way around. And so you've got a lot of the places that got described earlier don't show up here, and vice versa. And that's because they are saving space by only describing things once. And so if you would make a valuable player race, then you show up here in the species section. If you're just important politically as an outsider, then you show up in the other. And if you're important for both, then you will show up in both places. So some of these I don't remember. Like the Jai, I don't have the faintest idea who they are. But liberated Borg as a species, that's really exciting. If you want to be Hugh or Seven, or, as we saw in Star Trek Picard, there's tons of them eventually. The more that Federation figures out how to liberate them, the more liberated Borg they're going to be. And if you played Star Trek Online a lot, and I have played Star Trek Online to a ridiculous degree, there's a ton of liberated Borg in there as well. So that's a really fun option to have. One of the neat little talents they can take is Borg implants, and then there's this whole section of Borg implants right here. Anyway, hooray! Then we get some more of these species, and you might not remember all of them, but they're included here because they're interesting. The Okampa, that's Kess and her people. Pendari, that's Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Way back when he was just breaking into acting, he was in that one episode, the Tsunkatse, as like a pit fighter, and it was amazing and ridiculous at the same time. Well, you can be his species, which has, Born to Fight and all these great. So, like, if you want to smell what the Rock is cooking in the Delta Quadrant, you can do it. Talaxian, that's Neelix. And so, lots of neat things. And then, we get more of them over here. The Zal, who knows what those are. Now that we get into starships, and this is where we get back to the Borg. And again, like I said, this I think is going to be of the most utility to most players. So the different Borg ships, the probes, the cubes, all of these neat things out there. And then there's different other kinds of ships, like if you want to have a Delta Flyer like Voyager had, and the different freighters and different ships of all these various things. Hydrogen, honestly, I wish there was more about them. They're not presented as a player race, which is disappointing, and I don't know why they didn't do that. And there is a far too brief description of them earlier in the early section, but at least when we get here, they do finally get into the hydrogen in pretty good detail when they talk about the adversaries, whether they are ships or people. We finally get a lot of good hydrogen descriptions. Hydrogen have the potential to be the Klingons or the Romulans or the Cardassians of the Delta Quadrant. They are an extremely powerful species and organization, a government, a political entity. I can't remember if they're a kingdom or an empire or what they are, but they're neat, and I like them, and I kind of wish that they got a little more attention here. But anyway, so lots of neat ships. Hooray for lots of neat ships. And then this is where we get into the NPCs. And, they talk about some of the encounters first, weird little things that you can face. And this is full of, like, adventure seeds, which feels kind of weird, honestly. Like, why do we need to get a couple of paragraphs about, adventure hooks? And most of them are not even especially Delta Quadrant-y adventure hooks. Some of them are. They're just weird, and I don't understand. Like, Time Fugitive, this could show up in any quadrant. Why do we have 2 or 3 pages of adventure hooks? I don't know. But they're good adventure hooks, at least. I just don't know why they're in the Delta Quadrant book. Anyway, then we get to the NPCs, and there's a ton of them. Just a crapload of these things. Just more and more. And then, we even get some huge ones, because Voyager and Delta Quadrant were full of very weird life forms as well, including the Maw of Bliss, which is like a gigantic nebula. Photonic life forms. There were a lot of holograms that they ran into. Lots of different things like that. Anyway, more Borg, because we can never have enough Borg. So, descriptions of Borg space, ideas of what you're going to run into when you get to Borg, and then we get to all the Borg drone stats, which are wonderful. And you're going to have so much fun playing against the Borg. There's the Borg Queen. Lots of good descriptions of what the Borg Queen is all about, and how it works. Ideas of how to defeat and overcome not the entire Borg collective necessarily, but the one group that is attacking your players. How can you deal with them? And that's it. So, like I said, the Borg part is going to be really handy, and you're going to be very happy to have it. And I think that the book is worth it for the Borg alone. But the difficulty comes then with figuring out how to use the rest of this. And there's a couple of sidebars in there that I didn't show you that are like, well, here's a way to use the Delta Quadrant. But for the most part, their ideas are do what Voyager did. There is virtually no good discussion anywhere in the book of how you can do a Delta Quadrant native campaign. The assumption is always that you're going to be Starfleet characters. And so if you just want to be a bunch of Talaxians on the run because your people got destroyed by the Malon or whoever it was, you can do that, but you're going to have to make up a lot of stuff and fudge a lot of things. And then if you go with the Starfleet route, well, you're either full Voyager where you're stuck there, or you have the ability to go just for a couple of episodes, sample the smorgasbord of Delta Quadrant experiences, and then come back home again. And so, like, these are not necessarily problems, right? Game masters and player groups can come up with their own ideas. You could even go further and posit the kind of situation that they have in Star Trek Online, where there is a stable teleportation system. I think what they did in Star Trek Online is they went back to Enterprise and they got the sphere builders, and they're like, they're the ones that are going to give us this incredible ability to transport ourselves into the Delta Quadrant. And, so there's lots of ideas. If you want to have just free transit between the quadrants the way that we do with the Bajoran wormhole and the Gamma Quadrant, you can do that. There's different things you could do. You could just give your ship a transwarp drive that it got for whatever reason, and then it is the special ship that Federation sends out to the Delta Quadrant and back whenever they're working on stuff. You also have full freedom to choose what time frame you are setting your story in. This time frame matters a lot when we're dealing with the Gamma Quadrant because of the Dominion War. When you're dealing with the Delta Quadrant, it doesn't. The book kind of assumes, a Voyager era, but it doesn't have to be. You could set this after Voyager already comes home and dumps all its data in the Federation's lap, and the Federation figures out a way to travel there. Anyway, my point is, you can come up with any reasons that you want to get to the Delta Quadrant, but the book didn't bother coming up with any of them for you, except, like I said, for a couple of sidebars that mention, maybe you want to go there for 2 or 3 episodes because Q sent you. And so the low-hanging fruit has been picked, but if you want anything more complicated or more interesting or more intricate, you have to come up with it yourself. And I wish that they had taken a little more time to discuss what a Delta Quadrant campaign could look like that doesn't have to look like Voyager. And they didn't. It's very, very Voyager specific. And I suppose that's fine. It just feels very narrow to me. But at the end of the day, the information in here is all great. The Borg stuff is invaluable. And I suspect that any Star Trek Adventures group, especially big Voyager fans, are going to find lots of uses for this. You're not going to be able to use a lot of the Delta Quadrant specific races as easily as other things. You can't be like half Klingon, half Kazon unless you're setting this few decades in the future, or you come up with some very bizarre backstory. You can do it, again, but anyway, and then there are some things that have been left out. Like I said, I wish we got more talk about the hydrogen. I wish that Vidians had been made a player species, and Hyrogen for that matter. There's a lot of things that I wish we had more of, but I think for the most part, if you grab the Delta Quadrant book and then like the Science Division book, you can come up with all the weird, wacky concepts and species and anomalies and so on that you could ever possibly want for a Fringes of Space campaign. Anyway, that's the book. I really like it. I recommend it to you. I think that you and your groups will love it. So, thanks for watching this video. My name is Dan Wells, and I'm delighted to have you here. Thanks for watching. You're awesome.